I remember the exact sound of the front door the first time she walked into my life. It was the kind of creak that announces itself before you even look up. An old house settling, a secret stepping over a threshold. I was 27, fresh from a small town, bright eyes and a quiet hunger to make a marriage work. I thought love was the only recipe you needed for a life together. I learned that day, very quickly, that love is a small, soft stone when stacked against the kind of granite that some people carry inside them. Her name was Margaret, though everyone called her Margie. She wore smiles perfected in a mirror she'd practiced with for years. She wore those smiles like armor. They folded for weddings, for holidays, for photographs. But they never softened for me. When I married her son, Michael, she stepped into our life like someone rearranging furniture while we were asleep. She moved things without asking. She polished what she wanted to shine and broke what she did not know how to fix. At first I blamed the ordinary things. New marriage, new household dynamics. The way a mother loves her son in a way that never seems to consider the daughter-in-law as belonging. I excused a comment here, a small undermining there. I told myself, she's older. She's set in her ways. I told myself these were small stones I could pick out of my shoe. But stones have edges. Edges cut. Michael was gentle. He loved with the kind of tenderness that makes you lower your guard. He loved me in 1,000 small ways. The coffee he learned to make just so. The way he'd hum the lullabies his mother used to sing. The way he'd stand in the doorway and watch me as if watching was a kind of worship. I thought those were vows in motion. I was wrong about vows. I was wrong about how power works in a family. Margie's manipulations were not loud. They were not scenes with slammed doors or shouting in the kitchen. No, they were needlepoint work. A comment to Michael while I was in the other room. She doesn't understand how things are kept here. A call to my sister. I don't think she's right for Michael. A folded note on our table that said, "You know, the house is getting cluttered." She planted doubt like bulbs and waited for spring. It does something to your heart to watch your partner weigh another woman's words more heavily than your actions. It creates a small, civilized war inside the house. Michael loved his mother fiercely. He had been raised inside the sound of her voice. He did not hear the slow erosion of our life because he was listening for a different kind of noise. The one that said he was a good son. She wrapped him in that title like a blanket that needed constant tucking. I could not get him to see the threads she was pulling. The first real break came over something so mercilessly mundane I still taste it when I think of that day. We argued over an old painting, an heirloom that had belonged to his grandmother. Margie told Michael, in that soft, persuasive voice of hers, that I had moved it without asking. Michael confronted me with eyes that were not distrustful, but apologetic, as if I had somehow failed him. He demanded to know why I would disrespect his family's history. I tried to explain. I tried to remind him that I had actually cleaned the frame to help, that I had never meant to cause offense. He walked away, the painting still in his hand, and I watched the space between us lengthen like a hallway with too many doors. It kept going. Little indignities piled up like dishes in a sink. She invited herself to our dinner parties and then told our guests, with a laugh that cut, that my cooking was peculiar. She bought things for Michael and told him after, as if the courtesy of an announcement made the gift less of an intrusion. She whispered worries about our finances that were not true. She taught our child, our delicate, trusting child, to prefer her house for cookies and for stories, to coast back into her arms with a readiness that stung me. You learn, in time, to stop defending yourself. The more I tried to explain, the more the house felt like a stage where I was forever playing an unconvincing part. Michael stopped inviting me into the spaces where decisions were made. He started pausing before he answered when I spoke, searching not for truth, but for the echo that would please his mother. It was a quiet, steady slide. A marriage is an island you carve together. She began to whisper to him about tides and currents, as if he were the only captain. When I finally asked him, plainly, to choose between the life we were building and the life his mother held in her hands, he said a thing I will carry like a stone in my shoe forever. I can't lose my mother. He said it like a confession, like a wound he could not stitch without losing a piece of himself. He said it like a son, but not like a husband. So I left, not with a bang, not with dramatic suitcases and slammed doors. I left with a small cardboard box of what I could carry and a quietness inside me that felt, at first, like strength. You will come back, people said to me, or they said, you'll see, they'll call you. They predicted my return like weather. I did not return. I wanted to believe that absence would be a hammer that shaped them differently. I wanted to believe that walking away would fracture the careful lies Margie had constructed. Time moved in both the soft and brutal ways it does. I rented a small apartment, found work that kept my hands busy, and learned how to make my own coffee in the mornings. I let myself be small and ordinary in a way I had never permitted. There are freedoms in being unimportant to someone. There are also freight trains of loneliness. I learned to hold both. Then the day came when news washed upon me like a tide I had not expected. Michael fell ill. Not a little illness. A slow, hard one that softened his jaw and made his steps short. The kind of sickness where the world tilts and you measure by phone calls and fruit baskets. I heard about it through a neighbour. I heard how Margie was flustered. She called everyone she knew to patch the hole, to stitch the problem with hands that had never been taught gentleness. She called doctors who promised quick fixes. She called the relatives who would bring casseroles and not ask questions. People called me too, old friends, some who had witnessed the small cruelties over the years. They told me what I already knew. Margie would show up like a whirlwind. She would call herself the pillar. She would put on the halo of a saint when the cameras folded away. It was a role she wore better than any other. And somewhere beneath the news of Michael's illness, a quieter thing began to stir inside me. Not pity at first, not for Michael, and not a desire to be soft. It was, very plainly, an idea. If she thought she could sew herself into every narrative, the rescuer, the matriarch, the grieving mother, then perhaps that was where her undoing would begin. She had built her identity around being indispensable. The more indispensable she believed she was, the harder she would fall when that indispensability was stripped away. I could not bring myself to wish him harm. The coldness I carried was not cruelty toward Michael. It was a calculator of justice aimed at the woman who had carved her life around power over others. So I started small. I started where anyone with a voice and a memory can start, with the truth. I began by calling people who had seen things they had not wanted to say. I called the neighbour who had heard the sharp tones and hurried apologies at 3 a.m. when Michael came home late and bruised. I called old co-workers who had watched Margie plant seeds of doubt about my capabilities at community events. I called the woman who had once been my friend and who had married into the same family. The one Margie had warned off for reasons that never added up. They all had stories. They all, one by one, confirmed what I had carried like a dull ache. It's amazing how the world listens when what you say fits the shape of what they already suspect. People loved Margie because she gave them the face of someone dignified at the wrong moments. They also loved scandal. They loved the unspooling of a narrative where the matriarch might not be as saintly as the altar she built for herself. The truth, laid beside her well-chosen stories, looked like a chisel. I gathered the stories not to parade them like trophies, but to lay them down like breadcrumbs that would lead anyone who looked deeply to the fault lines she had disguised. I didn't need much. A few letters she'd written to a cousin. A voicemail where she laughed about making sure the right people thought the right thoughts. A receipt for a lawyer she'd consulted the year I left, not for custody or for care, but for something colder, to control the property and the narrative. Little things became a map. Then I approached Michael's doctor. I did what I could to be practical, to know the extent of his care, to see the chart where his decline lived like a black ink. The doctor, who had known Michael as a patient for years, was not surprised by my concern. He was surprised, perhaps, because I was the last person anyone had expected to show up with steady, clear intention. But I was methodical. I visited the hospital. I arrived with documents, with calls logged, with exactly the kind of quiet certainty that does not invite argument, but insists on presence. Margie, who had been used to occupying rooms like a queen, was suddenly confronted with an arena she could not dominate. Medical forms require signatures. Insurance policies require cooperation. There are rules that do not bend to charm. When you build power on the art of persuasion, you are at a loss when bureaucracy stands in the way and asks for proof. I learned how to file for temporary guardianship the right way. I learned the language that social workers respect. I learned what to say to nurses who are weary and suspicious of theatrics. I learned, more importantly, to listen. To Michael when he could still whisper. To the staff who told me truth gently. To myself when the coldness inside me wanted to roar. When the guardianship paperwork was presented, Margie was furious. Oh, she could be furious with a smile. She could sharpen anger into a weapon that looked like concern. She accused me in the hallway, in front of the staff, in a voice that trembled with rage and age both. She called me names that had been used in the past, like small bills, unpaid, and not to be trusted. She cried, theatrically, with the kind of performance that earns pity from strangers. But there was paper. There were witnesses. There was a social worker who had seen the old pattern and who had the patience to listen to both sides. The logic of the documents did not bend to her rhetoric. The system moved forward not because I wanted it to, but because it needed someone to do the hard, quiet work of care without the performative parts. That, to her, was the first cut. Power was not taken from her in one grand gesture. It was eroded in the everyday, in the way that requires persistence. Meals scheduled, medications supervised, doctor's appointments kept. Margie fumed, and she prowled the corridors like a lioness who had been muzzled. She tried to bully nurses, to charm administrators, to conjure allies. None of it worked. Her allies were people who had long ago learned to value appearances over accountability. When presented with paperwork and witnesses, they were uninterested in scandal. As Michael's condition stabilized under the steady routine I had set, not because I wanted credit, but because it was what needed to be done, something subtler happened. The people who had once admired Margie for her stagecraft started to notice the difference between role and reality. They began to ask questions. If someone is always saving the day in public, what is she doing when there are no cameras? If someone can be tender and cold with such ease, who has taught them to practice that skill? When the truth came into the light, it did not fall like a hammer. It leaked slowly, like the kind of rain that softens earth until roots are revealed. People who had been on the periphery came forward. A cousin admitted that Margie had sabotaged relationships she saw as threats. An old friend confessed that Margie had spread rumours subtly and skillfully about my character. The more they spoke, the more the image of Margie as the dignified matriarch cracked. Here is the thing about being a matriarch built on manipulation. People will forgive a great many sins if they can keep their image intact. They will parade the halo until the seams show. But once you strip away the stage, once you show that the halo is leather and not light, the people who were happy to stand in your glow will begin, very quietly, to step back. Margie did not fall with thunder. She fell in small gestures that were more humiliating because they were public and ordinary. Invitations stopped arriving. Calls that used to be regular dwindled to robust silence. She went to church and found empty pews where heads once bowed and smiled at her as if to say, "We never meant to be blind." She tried to control the narrative by planting stories about me, that I was ambitious, that I sought revenge. But when someone is deeply familiar with the truth, rumour can't take root. Her son, Michael, watched much of this from behind the fog of illness. Illness has a clarity you do not expect. It strips vanity in ways you are unready to accept. There were times he looked at me with the old tenderness, and then with the new realization that perhaps he had been wearing his mother's view of the world instead of his own. When he could speak plainly, he said things that were terrible to hear and terrible to love. "I thought I was doing right by you by being loyal to my mother. I thought loyalty meant obedience." Those words were a kind of breaking and a kind of beginning. My revenge, which some would call cold, was never about making Michael suffer. I would never be cruel to someone I had once loved with my whole chest. My revenge was directed at a woman whose habit it was to erode others' lives quietly, who would countenance control as love. I wanted her to lose the thing she prized most, the unquestioned loyalty of the people around her. I wanted her to stand in rooms where people lowered their eyes and to feel the hollowing of absence. It worked, slowly. Friends stopped calling. People who had once sought her out for advice found their way without her. The children she had manipulated to her will learned with adult eyes what they had been taught. The husband she had shielded from seeing the truth started to stand beside a woman who would not be quiet and who would do the hard work to make right what had been wrong. When the worst of Michael's illness passed and the bright, small man who had fallen sick reappeared, there were new conversations. He apologized in ways that were both sincere and painful. He took me by the hand, not because Margie was watching, but because he had learned what it means to choose someone. He learned it because the house had been emptied of the person who wanted to sit at its centre. Margie tried, at moments, to come back. She tried with the old smile, with the old stories, with casseroles at the door and soft calls late at night. She offered repentance in the measured way of someone who believes they can buy forgiveness with rituals. I listened, because listening is a kindness that even those who have wronged us deserve sometimes. But I did not let her step into the places she had broken. I had learned that some doors you can close softly and permanently. I had learned that silence is a punishment more severe to certain people than any scandal. The true punishment, for her, was not a public spectacle. It was the knowledge that she had been unmasked, not by vengeance, but by persistence and truth. It was the way the world turned away from her, as if from a portrait that had been repainted and found hollow beneath the brush. It was the quiet of a church where no one calls her name. It was the slow, humiliating awareness that being indispensable is a fragile throne. People sometimes ask me, in voices that are softer than they think, if I regret the steps I took. They look for a crack in my calm, a hint of softness that would show me fractured. I do not regret building a life that requires me to be small and true. I do not regret choosing care over theatre, honesty over manipulation. My revenge, if you must call it that, was not the theft of warmth. It was the removal of a weapon. There are mornings now when I make coffee and the house is quiet in a way that is no longer sharp with absence. Michael sits across from me and reads the paper. He smiles in ways that are different from before. They are not the smiles of a man trained to please a mother, but of a man learning to share a life. Sometimes he reaches across the table and takes my hand, and nothing dramatic happens. No band plays, no fireworks explode, just two people who, after a long winter, have chosen to be warm. Margie lives nearby. We see each other at family events, because blood drags people together like a tide. She has the same smile, softer now in practice. Sometimes she tries to speak to me, to wedge words into the gaps left by time. I offer her the small civility that makes the room bearable. I do not let her cross the boundary she had so carefully chewed away. She understands now, more than she ever allowed herself to, that power is a precarious thing. She feels the tremor of her empire, and it frightens her. If my story teaches anything, it is this. Revenge need not be violent to be exacting. It can be the patient work of reclaiming what was taken and the quiet resilience of building a life that does not yield to control. It can be the slow accumulation of acts so ordinary that they become heavy with meaning. It can be, at its coldest, the deliberate choice to remove your presence from the theatre you did not choose, and to let truth, for once, have the stage. I do not say that I am proud of the bitter places I visited in my heart. I am simply honest about them. Some people need theatre to feel safe. Some people need applause. I needed to stop applauding someone who had spent a life perfecting applause for herself. Last week, at a small family dinner, where we gathered for no grand reason but to eat and to breathe in each other's company, Margie sat across the table and ate in a silence that was not sacred. Her eyes found the plate more often than ours. She spoke less. Old allies sat a little farther away. When she tried to steer the conversation toward herself, people answered with facts and with care, not with the adoration she used to receive. It was enough. Not because I wish her pain, but because finally, after years of subtle violence, the world had mirrored back to her what she had been doing to others. She had to stand with that reflection. She had to reckon with the person who had been masked by kindness. That, in the end, was the punishment she could not practice away. So I sit now, sometimes, in the quiet, and I remember the creak of the front door that announced her entrance. I remember the way that small city of power inside her softened under pressure. I remember the many nights I cried in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and regret. I remember the day I learned that standing up for yourself does not make you unkind. It makes you whole. And I remember, with a certain cold satisfaction, that when a person builds their life on the belief that they are indispensable, the kinder revenge is to show them they are not. That was my revenge. It was not cruel. It was not loud. It was steady. It was the removal of a crown from someone who had never deserved to wear it. It was the watching of a queen find herself ordinary, and in that ordinary, finally human. Thank you for listening.